First, we'll take a look at some of the tall tales and the legends. We'll take a look at a couple of the better-known Ozarks legends. They may not be so well known that you've ever heard of them. Has anybody ever heard of the Headless Cobbler of Smollett Cave? So not that well known.
I haven't heard of Smollett Cave.
Smollett Cave. Yeah, there's a Smollen Cave, and then there's a Smollett Cave. This one is in Douglas County. And so have you've heard of Smollett Cave?
Yeah.
Okay. Probably never heard of the Headless Cobbler?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Yeah, now you know where your road trip is. Yeah, I was going to take you. Well, this is a good example of a supernatural legend from the Ozarks that probably has at least 1 foot in actual historical reality that probably wasn't all that supernatural. This by the early 20th century, this legend of the Headless Cobbler was very common in Douglas County and around that area. And people reported that in the vicinity of Smollett Cave, they would see, they considered this guy the Headless Cobbler because what it looked like was a headless person with shoes hanging off of his shoulders, like several pairs of shoes, tied up and hanging off of his shoulders. And what would usually accompany these sightings were people would hear coming from inside the cave, they would often hear tapping sounds as if someone was in there hammering and that kind of stuff. And it was almost always at dark, or at least when it was getting dark, that people would see this supposedly headless cobbler in the vicinity of Smollett Cave. And there was a guy back in the mid-20th century who was a graduate of the university here who decided he was going to look into this, and he did a lot of research trying to track down the origins of this headless cobbler legend. And he thought that he had found probably where they came from. And he was able to trace these stories all the way back to the Civil War era. That's always a good place, if you're talking about legends and all that kind of stuff. Let's go to the Civil War. Plenty of legends made then. But he found people and found some descendants who told stories about this old fellow by the name of Evans who lived in Douglas County in the Smollett Cave area. And he was a farmer and made shoes. And he was a Union supporter. And in an age when there were a lot of Confederate bushwhackers in the area who were very dangerous if you were a Union supporter. They might kill you or burn your house or something like that. The story goes that he had begun doing his work during the daytime, his work on shoes for his family and for whoever else he's working on these shoes for, in this cave. And he had all of his equipment in there and his hammer and whatever else he needed. And he would work in the cave, and then he would wait until dark to come out of the cave. And the idea that this study revealed is that probably the original sighting, if there was kind of an original event where someone spotted this headless cobbler, probably happened during the war. Someone probably saw him coming out of the cave. It was dark, shoes hanging off of this guy, and it may have looked like, a headless person carrying shoes. And this story, as legends do, kind of takes on different forms over the year. That old game, when you were a kid, did you ever play that game Post Office or Telephone, where they have, the one person tells a story and the next person tells it to someone else, and so on and so on. And by the time it goes through about 10 different versions, it comes out completely different on the end. And that's how legends are made often. And the idea was that this could have had some basis, in fact, from this cobbler in the Civil War era. But people continue to believe they see this headless cobbler off and on for years after the Civil War. And when this guy was doing his research in the 50s and the early 60s, there were still some elderly people from Douglas County who claimed that they had seen this apparition, this what seemed like a ghostly figure of a headless cobbler, whether or not they actually had. And they had their own legends over what this headless cobbler was doing in this cave in Douglas County. But from as near as this man could find out, it probably had some basis in fact. Not that the cobbler was headless in the Civil War, but that there actually was a cobbler in the Civil War era. And he probably did come out at night draped with shoes and stuff like that. So it's one of those legends that it's probably still, I bet, if you checked around, there's probably still some locals who would. Yeah. Yeah, I bet your grandmother's probably heard of it. And there's actually a book out now that the guy who did the research, his last name was Hayden, and he wrote a book that I think came out back in the 60s or maybe in the 70s. I think the book was called The Headless Cobbler of Smollett Cave. And in it, he goes into the various versions behind this legend and basically explains in a similar way to how I did, how he believes this legend came about. But this is just one of hundreds of local legends that you can get. This just happens to be one that someone has written a book about, so it's a little more accessible. But you go from one place to another in the Ozarks, and there are any number of these legends about one thing or another. And a lot of times they have to do with local historical events or, the Civil War. And we'll talk about some of these later in the class, some of the different themes that you get. But that's Smollett Cave's claim to fame. And I've never been to Smollett Cave. I need to go myself. Has anyone ever heard of the Joplin Spook light? It's actually not in Joplin, but that's the nearest town that most people have ever heard of, so it becomes the Joplin Spook light. This is one of several light phenomena around the country and around the world that people see and that scientists can't seem to explain why you see this light and why it shows up at this same place. And as you can imagine, when you've got something like an eerie-looking light that floats in the air somewhere on this dark back road, the explanations for why it's there are just unbounded. There are all kinds of legends surrounding this Joplin spook light. Many of them have to do with Indians, and you'll find that's a very common theme in the Ozarks and across the United States. Anytime you've got legends of the unexplained, they often are tied into Indian legends, and most often they're completely fabricated Indian legends. And not to be too skeptical, but more than likely the Indian legends that surround the Joplin spook light are just made up. One of them has to do with a very common theme in legends, not just Indian legends, but legends of any kind, and that are two young lovers who want to marry, but the father of the young woman says, no, the guy's not good enough for you, doesn't have enough wealth or whatever, and they run off together, and people from the tribe are chasing them down, and they get to a bluff over a river and hold hands and jump to their deaths off of the bluff. And it's only after that people start seeing the spook light. That's one of the more common legends affiliated with the Joplin spook light. There are other Indian legends. Some have, one of the other common legends is that the spook light is actually the lantern of an old miner whose family was all killed by Indians in the area, and his ghost to this day is still looking for his wife and children who were killed. Again, there's no evidence to suggest that any such event happened in that area, but it sounds like a pretty good legend anyway. And there are lots of other of these legends. The light, I believe, and this is another, I've never visited the Joplin spook light either. I'm guessing you got to be over there at night, and I'm never over in that area at night. But the light, I believe, is actually just across the line in Oklahoma. It's basically right on the state line, but I think you actually see the light just a little ways into Oklahoma. So it's not in Joplin, but it's in that area where Joplin and Missouri meet or where Missouri and Oklahoma meet in the Joplin area. And this is this is one that actually there's a Wikipedia page for this. So people still go and see the Joplin spook light. And I think I've had students in this class before who've told me that they've been, over to see the spook light. Has anybody ever been over there? Anybody ever heard of the spook light? Heard of it. Anybody else got spook lights in your own neighborhoods? I mean, it's not the only one. There are other of these kind of light phenomena.